In the early hours of April 15th, 1912, the Titanic ocean liner sank. Well over 1,000 people would lose their lives as the boat slipped into the icy water. But along with the ship and the people, some $2 million worth of ostrich feathers sank to the bottom of the ocean. Ostrich feathers were used by people since prehistoric times, but at the time of the sinking of the Titanic, their value was staggering. What nobody on board the Titanic could know was that this value was about to crash. The story is fascinating, but more than that, it shows us what life was like in the decades leading up to the First World War. There's a story of fashion and its history, the story of a global trade. There's a story of a bird, the story of Jews using their connections to build a global empire. There's a story of excesses and of exploitation. Let's follow the story from its earliest days to its crash. In the oldest archaeological sites where we find ostrich material, ostrich stuff, the objects we find are ostrich eggshell fragments, broken, small pieces of eggshells scattered about. Finding bits of ostrich eggshell in a rock shelter is common in some parts of Africa. Ostriches don't breed in caves, they make their nests out in the open. Therefore, finding ostrich eggshell pieces in a cave or a rock shelter means they were brought there by people. They're a good sign that you found a simple archaeological site. They were there for people to make beads. These people must have used the feathers, the skin for leather, and of course the meat. But eggshells would have been the main target. Eggs are easier to get than hunting whole birds, and eggs are nutritious, and once eaten, the eggshells are ideal for making beads, something humans have done for thousands of years. It's the eggshells that survive as artifacts. These artifacts belong to simple hunter-gatherer societies. But Africa is also home to the earliest signs that ostrich feathers had more important value in society. Ostrich feathers show up in ancient Egypt. The ostrich feather is associated with the Egyptian goddess Ma'at. Ma'at was the goddess of truth. She's often drawn with an ostrich feather on her head. In the Egyptian Book of the dead person's heart was weighed against an ostrich feather. If the heart was lighter than the feather, they'd lived a good life and could enter the afterlife. If not, the heart would be eaten by the demon Ammit. Apart from religion, ostrich feathers show up in ancient Egypt as decor and clothing. They were used to display wealth and status. Before the age of modern fashion, ostrich feathers were often symbols of wealth, used by the upper class and aristocracy. But their real boom time was to come with the Industrial Revolution. Before we look at that, let's learn about the birds first. Ostriches are African desert birds. They're birds that live in dry places. There are two species recognized today, the common ostrich and the Somali ostrich. There was another one, the now extinct Arabian ostrich. Obviously, ostriches are unique birds. Ostriches are related to birds such as emu, cassowary, kiwi, and rhea. But their last common ancestor with these birds dates back to the late Cretaceous. That's wild. The ostrich lineage split from all other living birds while dinosaurs were still alive. Modern ostriches breed in a scrape in the ground. The process begins with the formation of a dominant breeding pair, a major male and a major hen. Over several days, the major hen lays her eggs first. She usually lays 7 to 10 eggs herself. Each one is a huge investment of energy. Producing eggs this size places a big strain on her body. Proteins, fats, and minerals like calcium are drawn directly from her reserves. Once she's finished laying, the male begins mating with other, younger females, known as minor hens. These hens are then allowed to lay their eggs in the same nest. A single scrape can eventually contain 20 to 25 eggs, sometimes even much more. At first glance, this seems wrong. Why does the major hen let other birds lay eggs in her nest? But it may be a clever strategy. The major hen's eggs are laid first and tend to remain in the center of the nest, where they're better protected. Ostrich eggs take over 40 days to hatch, and during that time, the nest is vulnerable to predators. Predators such as hyenas, baboons, and historically people. During incubation, the female sits on the eggs by day, her gray feathers blending into the desert. The male takes over at night, his black plumage disappearing into the dark. In the end, only a fraction of the eggs hatch successfully. Those chicks are then raised by the dominant pair. In the Namib Desert in Namibia, my own long-term observations suggest that these earliest chicks are slightly larger. That would mean that the major hen's eggs are just bigger because they were laid first. Over the first few months, many babies will be taken by predators. But if her chicks are the biggest, they're the most likely to succeed. The ostrich's flightlessness dates back to its ancestors. The main role of the feathers is for temperature regulation, not for flight. It turns out this is a key to our story. Ostriches keep warm in the cold desert nights by using their feathers as a blanket. To do this, they need really fluffy feathers to trap air. But their feathers also allow them to keep cool in the summer heat. For this, they have strong muscles below their skin that contract to lift up the feathers. By lifting these feathers off their body, the feathers become shade. It seems to work so well that ostriches are often out in the heat when everything else is in the shade. A keen observer will notice that ostrich looks super tidy in winter when their feathers keep them warm, when they're compact. But they look scraggly in summer when their feathers are lifted off their body. There are many birds with beautiful feathers, but the fluff that keeps them warm and the strong barb that keeps them cool at night makes their feathers ideal for fashion. Around the 1860s, feathers started to become a vital part of fashion. The plumes were favored by a mix of royalty, high society, and influential stage performers. Actress Langtry famously used ostrich feathers associated with the Prince of Wales to publicize their royal affair. Stage icon Sarah Bernhardt incorporated them into dramatic theatrical costumes, influencing Art Nouveau fashion across Europe. Lily Elsie popularized the massive plume-draped Merry Widow hat, sparking a global craze. Royalty such as Alexandra of Denmark commissioned elaborate ostrich feather fans for major public events. Model Evelyn Nesbit helped define the early American Girl look with a single ostrich plume, while performers like the Gaiety Girls acted as early fashion influencers, driving the trend into the middle classes. Ostrich feathers were the thing. At their peak, the finest plumes were valued almost as highly as gold. The growth of this fashion was driven by factors you probably haven't thought of before. One big one was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution brought about a rich class of people who were not nobility. There was also the rise of a middle class, something that hadn't really existed before, and so even those who weren't rich but had some decent income wanted to dress well. In fact, even the poorest people would save up money to buy a fancy dress. The rise of textile factories go hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution. Clothes were now made in factories, but these same factories made the Industrial Revolution. At least they played a big part in it. Another big thing was color. Before this age, dyes were expensive and the colors you could produce were limited. With the development of science and industry, this changed and new dyes of fancy colors entered the market. Ostrich feathers in fashion were usually dyed spectacular colors. Before the Industrial Revolution, clothes were handmade, often by you or somebody in your family if you were poor. But now clothes had become a commodity. Not only could you now buy clothes, but you could also buy textiles and sewing machines, which allowed you to make or alter clothes at home. But now, with more choice of fabric and color and design. The shift in fashion consumption represented a truly radical transformation. What was once restricted to nobility was now available to many. No longer confined to the aristocracy or the elite, the ability to follow and participate in changing styles democratized appearance. In earlier centuries, the nobles decided what was cool. Think of Marie Antoinette of France, the Marie who later had some work done to her neck by a machine of her era. As the queen, she single-handedly decided what was okay to wear in the Palace of Versailles. This changed drastically in the closing decades of the 1800s. The queen and her court would no longer be the ones who decided who could be fancy. Another factor that would increasingly play a role is print media. In earlier times, newspapers were just print, just text, but by the start of the 1900s, a technique known as half-tone printing allowed photographs to start appearing in newspapers and magazines. Before this, you really couldn't know what was fashionable in Paris unless you were there. It's so hard to imagine in an age where media is flooding our lives. But if you think about it, this would have had a massive impact on what fashion was to become. In an age when fashion was becoming a thing, one trend that would appear over and over would be wanting to be extravagant. For women of the day, this often meant adding decorative elements to their outfits. One example of this was artificial flowers. If you think of artificial flowers today, you think of fake plastic. But in the 1800s, this was actually created by skilled workers, and each flower took dedicated hours of work and would therefore sell for significant amounts. They would be made with dyed cloth and dyed feathers. But feathers weren't just used in elements like artificial flowers, they were decorative in and of themselves. Feathers of many different birds were used, and of course, ostrich feathers were a part of this. But ostrich feathers had advantages over other feathers. Ostrich feathers were massive. Huge feathers were the perfect accessory to let you show off some extravagance. They were fluffy, much more fluffy than the feathers of flying birds. To lift those feathers off the body of the bird during summer, those big plumes needed to be strong. That strength resulted in a large, sturdy central shaft. They were stronger than things like peacock feathers, for example. Something else that came to be important was that they could be plucked off living birds. Most of the other showy feathers came from birds that you had to shoot and kill. At the time, the first animal rights groups were just getting started, among them being the SPB, which would later become the RSPB, and the Audubon Society. They were directly involved in the fight to stop birds and other animals from being used in fashion. Farming ostriches and plucking their feathers meant that these birds didn't have to be hunted. Not only was this better to avoid wiping out the birds, it also meant that production could be scaled up. By farming, far more feathers could be brought to market. The design of hats and other headgear is called millinery. The biggest use for ostrich feathers were on big tall hats. Not only that, they were a part of all sorts of shows of extravagance. Even at fancy funerals, ostrich feathers would be a part of the decoration to show that this was a wealthy person. The fashion was based in the big cities of the day. Fashion had been very important in France for centuries. Before the French Revolution, as we mentioned, fashion was something that belonged to the nobles. And as a result of the French Revolution, where nobility had been stripped away, the everyday person wanted to share in this too. And fashion became a way to show you were rebelling against the old monarchy. As a result, Paris became home to fashion before fashion was a thing. And ostrich feathers had been fashionable there from early on. This was soon spread to London, at the time the hub of the huge British Empire. The British had the advantage of being able to bring things in from their colonies and to incorporate them into the fashion of the day, and this included ostrich feathers. New York was fast growing into an important city, and the fashion from Europe was having a big impact there. So the ostrich feather boom was centered in Paris, London, and New York. Tripoli sits in the country of Libya, at the top of Africa. For centuries, goods had moved over the Sahara Desert to cities like Tripoli, to be shipped across the Mediterranean Ocean to Italy and on to elsewhere in Europe. These goods had included slaves for a long period of time. It also included many animal products from skins to ivory, but also included ostrich feathers. Ostrich were native to the enormous, dry, semi-desert regions south of the Sahara Desert, and ostrich feathers that were coming into Europe had been hunted from wild ostrich. It turns out that the very finest ostrich for the ostrich feather market were coming from these regions. But there was a limiting factor. You could only shoot so many ostrich, and the trade over the Sahara was something measured in many months. It's interesting to note that Jews already formed a big part of the trade in ostrich feathers in Tripoli, and as our story continues, they keep being players right up until when the industry crashes. A complex supply chain emerged. starting with skilled buyers purchasing the finest feathers from camel trains. This led to processing centers where feathers were cleaned and sorted, establishing connections via shipping to European markets. With fashion growing and ostrich feathers becoming more and more in demand, there was a massive opportunity here. Feather barons, as they were called, were from Oudtshoorn. Oudtshoorn is a town in a semi-desert in South Africa. Most towns in the region are small and have very little of interest to see. Oudtshoorn has its feather palaces, which you can still visit today. These feather palaces represent a time when the region dominated the world's ostrich feather market. At the peak of the market, there were more than 700,000 birds farmed there. Since the early 1800s, and officially since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Cape Colony was part of the British Empire. The colony was the southwestern part of what is now South Africa. The British took control of the Cape for its strategic location on trade routes, into which the ostriches soon integrated. Key factors in Oudtshoorn's unlikely rise to prominence in this market include an incubator, an ideal location, a type of feed, and the connections and support of the Jewish community to its needy members. In 1869, a man named Arthur Douglas invented an ostrich incubator in the Cape Colony. Earlier in the 1860s, there had been a drought in the region, and sheep and cattle were struggling. Farmers were experimenting with local game as livestock. With this incubator, ostriches became a trendy local animal to try to raise on farms. It turned out that ostriches do well as a farmed animal here. With the demand for ostrich feathers in the fashion market, this was a big success. Oudtshoorn is in the semi-arid Little Karoo, which is an ideal climate for ostriches, but it's also just over the mountains from the sea, providing easy access to world markets. The town's magistrate, Mr. Schultz, who had ostriches himself, imported alfalfa, called lucerne in South Africa, which is a hardy, drought-resistant forage crop. Ostriches did very well on this feed. As Jews had been very prominent in the business in North Africa, soon numerous families moved into the town to start their own ostrich farming ventures. Many of the Jews who immigrated to the colony were Lithuanian Jewish refugees. As a recent immigrant, you were more likely to get a loan and other assistance if you were part of the community. And buyers, many of whom were Jewish too, moved into the region and started to trade with the farmers. The buyers, keen to make money off this booming market, often made loans to aspiring ostrich farmers. These loans allowed many of these farmers to start up and grew the industry rapidly. There were many rags to riches stories, but these loans and debts came to bite them all when the industry eventually crashed. It's interesting to read texts of the time because many people realized that the ostrich market depended on fashion, and fashion is fickle business. But even those who thought this was risky business could not have predicted how spectacular the crash would be, or what would cause it. Some farmers and investors were more careful and diversified their investments, but others were blinded by the chance to make a lot of money. For decades, this worked well. As a fashion market, there were ups and downs, and there had been a downturn in the 1880s. But every time fashion would change, it would come back, and often be even bigger, at least until the final crash. A secret mission was undertaken to secure the Barbary ostrich for the Oudtshoorn farms. There was a name for these feathers, double fluff. The South Africans knew getting their hands on double fluff feathers would help make them untouchable in the industry. But there was a problem. Barbary ostriches weren't found in any region held by the British. These had to come from regions south of the Sahara. These ostrich had been hunted too heavily and had become rare. The Cape ostrich farmers were very eager to get their hands on these ostriches. In 1911, Russell Thornton, the official agriculturalist for the government of the Cape Colony, set off for an expedition to the region where these mythical feathers were found. The region was part of the French and Ottoman empires, so they had to be very stealthy about their intentions. It would take them many months, and they ended up buying some worthless ostriches just to hide their true intentions. Despite the troubles, they eventually managed to sneak out 156 Barbary birds, and 140 of them survived the travel back to South Africa, where they were considered a big success for the region. Little did they know that their success would mean very little within a couple of years. The fashion trends were set in Paris. What was fashion in Paris would spread to London and then on to New York and other large cities in Europe and America. I don't think there was much of a market outside of Europe and America, as far as I could see. The industry had grown up. Steamships started to transform trade routes. If the Sahara trade routes were measured in years, modern steamships of the day allowed trades with goods from the colonies to be a monthly thing. This resulted in regular auctions for goods, including ostrich feathers. Like much of the trade in London, the traders and workers in the ostrich feather business were largely Jews. They had dominated the business since the early days when Tripoli was their headquarters. They kept in contact with family and friends in different parts of the world and therefore had an insider's view of the business in dispersed places. Once the raw ostrich feathers finally arrived in European ports, an extensive and often grueling process of refinement began before they were deemed fit for the fashion market. This initial stage involved basic cleaning, which was essentially removing dirt, dust, and natural oils that had accumulated during transport. Following cleaning, the feathers were meticulously sorted. This sorting was a highly labor-intensive task performed by workers, often women and children, who toiled for long hours in conditions that were frequently far from ideal, accepting very little pay for their difficult and repetitive work. The environment was often dusty and poorly ventilated, a testament to the exploitative labor practices of the era. After the initial preparation, the focus was shifted to preparing the plumes for commercial sale and integrating into millinery. This preparation involved a series of intricate and often specialized processes. One of the most visually impactful steps was the dyeing of the feathers, transforming the natural white, black, or grey plumes into a dazzling spectrum of colors, crimson, emerald, sapphire, and various pastel shades, to match the latest European fashion dictates. Achieving vibrant and uniform coloration required expertise in chemical processing and careful handling to prevent damage to the delicate barbs. Although the inherent strength and resilience of the ostrich plume were a key selling point, making it superior to less durable alternatives, the feathers still required manipulation to allow for precise shaping and sculpting. Particularly for the elaborate hats of the period, fine wires were often carefully inserted along the spine of the quill. This internal strength allowed the milliner to mold the feather into the desired sweeping curve, dramatic coil, or cascading shape. This combination of raw material excellence, chemical treatment, and mechanical support transformed the natural product into a high-fashion commodity. New York was booming and fashion was big. This was why the Titanic had ostrich feathers on board. The trade worked much the same way as it had in London, but America had something that the UK lacked: semi-arid land. Towards the last years of the ostrich feather market, there was a big drive to start farming ostriches in the US. The most famous of these farms would be the Corsten farm in California. But through poor practices and poor timing, the market never worked out in the US. Try as they might, ostrich feathers never reached the success they'd seen in Oudtshoorn. At the start of 1914, ostrich feathers were an absolutely booming market. In the previous years, prices had skyrocketed. At its peak, it was the South African region's fourth biggest export, behind gold, diamonds, and wool. But this would suddenly end. In the late morning of June 28, 1914, Gavrilo Princip fired his pistol in Sarajevo and set off a sequence of events that would lead to the outbreak of the Great War, World War I. But to say that World War I killed the market is missing some of the interesting details. The primary cause was the war. Super luxury, expressed with feather fashion, now appeared cold. In the war, clothing changed to simplicity and functionality. A related factor was the impact on trade routes. Much of the British merchant fleet was now used in war, either directly or indirectly by supplying foods and goods to the military, or by keeping supply lines open for essentials like food. But war alone couldn't stop the industry from returning. Something else had changed. Cars. The cars of the era were open. A big flashy hat that was a fine showpiece on a horse cart didn't work in an open car. About 80% of Oudtshoorn's ostrich farmers would declare bankruptcy in 1914. Some just let their ostriches run free or killed them out of anger. Some who'd been poor before their quick rise to wealth took their own lives. The crash was devastating. Despite moments of popularity at different times in different places, most ostrich feathers to hit the market after 1914 were for feather dusters. The boom was dead.